Hello, everyone. Just to introduce myself, so Sarah Worley from the UK. I'm the founder of the Key Clinic, and I'm going to be picking up really on a lot of the things that Dr. Deutsch was talking about, because the clinic that I run is multidisciplinary. It focuses on many different neuroplastic techniques as well as nutritional techniques to try and help recover children. So we specialize in children with learning and behavioral difficulties, but inevitably we end up treating the parents as well very often. So, and I just want to say thank you to Dr. Deutsch really for forging the way for neuroplasticians, biohackers around the world, and really getting people to recognize just how flexible the brain is. Because it is an extraordinary time to be involved in neuroscience, because we now understand the brain is continually rewiring itself every minute of every day. And that neuroplasticity gives us, as described, the ability to overcome problems that were really once deemed life sentences for people, very debilitating conditions. And at the same time, in terms of genetics, we now know through recent discoveries and breakthroughs in epigenetics that even our DNA blueprint is no longer our inevitable fate. And that actually, if you provide the right stimulation, you're able to turn on and off the expression of particular genes. And to me, this gets very interesting, especially when we start talking about neurotransmitter levels. So where does all this leave conventional medicine? I would say with a slightly uneasy feeling. I don't know if you can read that from back there. It's just one of my favorite Larson cartoons. But anyway, it's an uneasy feeling because inevitably, whenever something is cutting edge and it's completely new, it takes decades, sometimes it even takes lifetimes before it trickles down to become the widely accepted protocol. And this is a real problem because we're facing really a global epidemic of mental health problems at the moment and learning and behavioral difficulties. The estimated cost is some $1.4 trillion globally. I have no idea how they arrived at that figure, but it sounds like a pretty big figure to me. When you look at the incidence of autism, for example, we know that in the 1980s, it was 1 out of every 10,000 kids that was diagnosed with autism. That number is now up to 1 in 80. There's been an explosion of dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADD, ADHD. More and more of us, I think it's 10 to 15% of adults will have some form of depression or anxiety within any given year. So there seem to be greater numbers than ever. And the question is, what's changed? You know, is it just that we're now so much better at picking these things up and diagnosing them and that we missed them before? That certainly accounts for some of the change, but not all of it. When you actually crunch the numbers, maybe 10 to 15%, certainly with things like autism. But there are other theories. There's the toxic tipping point notion that maybe these children that are developing hyperactivity, autistic spectrum, are like the canaries in the mine, and we've reached a sort of toxic tipping point, and they're the ones who are not as able genetically to be able to kick out certain toxins. Another theory is talking about how much stress we have today. You know, and I personally find it hard to think we've got more stress than our ancestors. I mean, we just have to look back at previous world wars to see that isn't the case. But what we have is a different type of stress. We have an ongoing, relentless nature to stress today that we didn't have before. Another thing that's changed, certainly when we're looking at childhood developmental and learning differences, is that we are now, we talked earlier about being able to biohack our way beyond evolution, and we're doing that very capably. So we are having babies later and later into life. We're able to use IVF and put together a sperm and an egg that otherwise perhaps wouldn't have got together. So in other words, we're creating life where there wasn't life before, and we're sustaining life where there wasn't life before. So what is the conventional medical approach to treating all of these things? So I was dumbfounded. I had to put the statistic up here. 70% of parents who were told that their child was autistic were told by the NHS in the UK, tough. There's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Just stiff upper lip, you know, learn to put up with it. They'll probably be institutionalized. That's all there is one can do. Of course, there's also the notion of suppressing the symptoms, and we know that prescriptions of stimulants like Ritalin have quadrupled over the past decade. More and more and more people becoming reliant on antidepressants, even though we know from studies they're only about 38% effective. That's another whole conversation. We know that actually serotonin reuptake inhibitors can be damaging for another subset of people, but there's no biomarkers that are tested before these prescriptions are made. So we can try and suppress the symptoms, or we can try to retrain the brain to be able to find ways around the problem, ways to compensate for the problem. So if we look at learning support, supposing a child can't write, they might be told, well, here, take a keyboard, forget about writing, we're just going to use the keyboard. Or if they're very distractible, the teacher might say, come and sit at the front of the class, or wear these sound-dampening headphones, and it might improve your concentration. And if we look at brain training techniques, and even things like psychotherapy, conscious brain discussing something with conscious brain, neocortex to neocortex, there is an assumption that somehow that cognitive part of the brain is going to be able to assert control over the reactions, the emotions that we're feeling. So to me, the question is, why are we so obsessed with the neocortex? Perhaps it's because it is the sexy part of the brain. You probably didn't think the brain had a sexy bit, but it does have a sexy bit because it's the bit that separates us from animals. It's the bit that allows us to outstrip evolution. It's the last bit of the brain to develop in utero. It's the last bit of the brain to have evolved. So we can see why everyone likes to focus on it. And yet, it is only 20% of the brain. And actually, it's the supporting 80%, the kind of supporting act, that really is defining the way in which we're able to perform or not perform. And very often it's the bit that's driving our reactions. We like to think the conscious bit is in the driving seat, but we're all masters of post-rationalization on that. So when we talk about the brain, historically, this is how we viewed it, sort of pickled in a glass jar sitting on a shelf somewhere, and there's been psychiatry over here and medicine over there, and never the twain should meet. But I'm sure everyone in this room completely appreciates, of course, that isn't the way it really works. The brain doesn't sit on a shelf and pickled in a jar. It's actually within our bodies. And because of that, it doesn't function in complete isolation. So, for example, if I'm in a state of chronic pain, I'm going to behave completely differently than if I'm not. My brain is going to function completely differently than if I'm not. And then there's the influence of the gut, which people refer to as the second brain. We know that some 80% of our neurotransmitters are manufactured in the gut. So it seems completely obvious that if the gut isn't functioning right, of course the brain's not going to be functioning right. Toxins, internal, external toxins. I mentioned before this toxic load that autistic children are under, but you can also have internally generated toxins. If you've got gut dysbiosis, they'll be kicking off a lot of toxins that, again, have the ability to radically alter the way in which the brain is functioning. Inflammation. There was a great book written, I don't know if you had a chance to read it this year, by a psychiatrist called Ed Bullmore, talking about the inflamed mind. And that was really interesting because he was able to show that it isn't just if you're in a state of, say if someone's got arthritis and they develop depression, the assumption has been, well, you would be depressed, wouldn't you? You've got arthritis, you can't move. But actually what he's been able to show is that blood-brain barrier is not as impermeable as we thought. And actually, some of the inflammatory response is able to pass through it into the brain, cause inflammation, and physically cause depression. And again, that's going to alter the way the brain functions. Food and drug effects. Really important. When I see those videos of autism, one of the first things I want to do is carry out a really simple, straightforward urine test that will tell us whether this could be playing a part in it. So there are some people who are just unable to digest the protein in gluten and in casein, so in the protein in milk. And what happens is that this passes partially undigested into the bloodstream as a form of morphine, morphine peptide. It's gliamorphine and casomorphine. But they're very similar to a sort of heroin-like effect, and they're small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier and radically alter behavior. Now, there was a survey done in the States, and I think it was based on 25,000 parents of autistic kids. And the question was a very simple one. It was, out of everything you've tried, what's the single most effective intervention? 65% said taking gluten and dairy out of the diet. Not sticking them on Ritalin, not giving them stimulants, simply taking this away. And I've had personal experience to see the dramatic change that that can make in someone's life. Oh, did I just click ahead? I think we've got to go back. I might have been clicking there without realizing it. So actually, can we go all the way back? Yeah, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Yeah, that's it, perfect. So food and drug effects, distorted sensory input. And Dr. Deutsch was talking about, you know, the sheer impact that having a distorted message from your ears can have on the brain. And it can be a similar thing with distorted eyes that aren't able to move as they should do. You might not need to wear glasses, but maybe they can't track smoothly, for example, across a line of writing. And then the last bit, and the bit I'm going to talk more about today, are immaturities within the central nervous system. Again, those sort of subcortical, 80% of the brain, that if that isn't working right, it's as though the autopilot isn't working correctly. So the reason for mentioning all of these things is to say these are all things that can be negatively biohacking the brain. So I think the question for us when we talk about biohacking is, where do we start? Because not everyone is starting from the same point. And if there's something within the system that's creating negative biohacking, whatever your methodology is, it's not going to be as effective as it would do if you took away the negativity first of all. So this is why I've tried to come up with a kind of hierarchy of needs, a neuroplastician's hierarchy of needs. And I know certainly when people come to our clinic, this is the order in which we will assess where they need intervention. So the very first one is that metabolic cellular health level. Are there toxins? Is the system functioning as it should? One of the things that we utilize in there is something called nutrient therapy. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Walsh Institute, but really groundbreaking work which has been able to alter levels of neurotransmitters in the brain through really targeted use of vitamins and minerals. So, for example, if the copper to zinc ratio is completely out, you will be producing way too much adrenaline and you will be in a chronic state of anxiety. If you are undermethylated, you won't have enough serotonin in the brain. If you're overmethylated and you take an SSRI because you're feeling depressed, it will kick you over into suicidal depression. So actually, there are a series of very simple biochemical tests, really, that we will carry out, certainly if someone's hyperactive or if they're on the spectrum or depressed. Having got past that level, we then look at lower brain maturity. And as I said, I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about exactly what I mean by that. But it's the neglected part of the brain, the bit that no one ever really seems to talk about, but a critical part of the brain. Accurate sensory input from the eyes, from the ears. And only once we're sure we've eliminated any possible negative biohacking do we then start looking at the neocortical functioning, all the marvelous sort of brain-enhancing, brain-training games that are out there. And then very top of the pyramid, having some sense of purpose, which sounds like such a basic thing to say, but you know, you could have the whole of your system as honed, as biohacked to pieces. It could be like you're driving a Ferrari, but if you've got no reason to go from A to B, it's pretty pointless having it. And I was amazed the other day. I was listening to a radio interview, and it was actually based on a survey which they gave to UK workers, and they said, if you were to give up your job tomorrow, who would miss it? Who would suffer as a result of you not doing your work? And an amazing 80% said, absolutely no one, because my job is completely pointless. Right? I don't know if it tells you something about the UK, but it's certainly enough reason to be depressed. But you know, if you look at it from that perspective, depression's actually an evolutionary tool. Don't pop a pill, change your life, you know. Find something better to do that gives you some sense of purpose and of mission. So I'm going to talk a little bit, as I said, about that neglected part of the brain, the subcortical structures. So when we're born, our brains are only about 20% developed. God knows we couldn't walk on two legs and give birth if it was any more developed. That's why the brain is only 20% developed when we give birth. And what happens within that first year of life, there's a series of what we call primitive reflexes that develop. One comes up, gets stimulated, and then it integrates to the system. The next one comes up and stimulates, it integrates within the system. And it's a set sequence for all of us, a set pattern that it goes through. And each time a baby is making those repetitive movements, it's creating the wiring in the brain needed for so much of what we do to happen like on a sort of autopilot later on in life. So we don't have to give it much thought. It's the sort of automatic system that just makes life easy for ourselves. So in theory, we end up looking like that. We end up with all the neural connections having happened as they should do. But of course, inevitably, this isn't always the case. So that process can get stuck, and it can get stuck for a whole myriad of different reasons. Maybe the mother had a lot of stress and perhaps some illness during the pregnancy. Maybe there were complications during the delivery. Did the baby get stuck? Was there any fetal distress? Was the baby born early? Was the baby born late? Were forceps used? Was von Hughes used? Was it a C-section birth? Afterwards, did the baby miss any motor stages, for example, that they were meant to go through? I mean, I see a lot of parents who are thrilled when they say, oh, my child was walking at 9 months of age. God, you know, they're clearly super advanced. I'm thinking, no, it's a disaster. They needed to crawl, and they needed to keep crawling for a certain period of time to create the wiring in the brain for everything to be much easier later on. So it can get stuck, and when it gets stuck, it's like a scratch on the record. So normally, by 1 year of age, we hope this whole process has finished. But when it is stuck, it can mess up your spatial awareness, your balance, your coordination. It messes up how the eyes track. It messes up cognitive functioning. It messes up many things. So these are the kids that sit in the class and have to work 10 times harder than the next kid, just to try to achieve the same. It's not that they're any less intelligent. They're perfectly intelligent, but they cannot access that intelligence. So it's the way it results, really, is that they end up feeling stupid. They end up with complete loss of self-esteem and just thinking, clearly it's some problem with my brain. And the first thing I tell them is it's got nothing to do with your brain, actually. It's got to do with these very basic things that just never went away, that are tripping you up. And actually, an important point on that, when you have neurodevelopmental delay, these are the people that are less resilient than others. So again, if we think about why people spiral into depression, for example, we spend a lot of time talking about the events that lead to it. Well, I got depressed because it was a hideous divorce. You know, I got depressed because I lost all my money. I got depressed for whatever the reason. And yet there are some people who go through horrendous things, much, much worse things, and it's sort of like water off a duck's back, as though nothing's happened to them. And then you get another person that the tiniest thing happens, and they crumble, and they just can't handle it. Now, to me, that's really, really interesting, because I believe it's the people that are already under an enormous internal stress within their systems, just to keep the day-to-day going. The autopilot's not switched on. Nothing's happening easily for them. They're the ones that crumble the minute that stress gets too much. So I'm just going to give you a little example here of a reflex. So this first one, and how debilitating it can be when it gets stuck. This first one is called the ATNR reflex.
The asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, also known as the ATNR, is present at birth. When your baby's head is turned to the right arm and leg extend, while the left leg and arm are flexed or bent at the elbow and knee. 8-week-old Laura demonstrates this reflex. This is also called the fencing reflex because it looks like the baby is taking a fencing pose. If you pay close attention to your baby's movements, you will notice it is not just random flailing. Their movements fall into patterns such as this. Watch what happens when Laura turns her head to the right. The left elbow bends and the right arm extends long.
Okay, so this little reflex, it happens between about 4 to 6 months of age, and it's really important because the baby's learning, oh, I've got this half, I've got this half, because up until then, babies just move everything all at once, okay? So they're creating that brain map differentiation of one half to the other half. When you see babies at this stage, they're endlessly staring at, oh, I've got this hand, and I've got this hand. You think, what's so interesting? You know, why do they keep staring? But they're also training their eyes to track in the horizontal plane. So it's a really important reflex. Should have gone by 6 months of age. When it gets stuck, And here's the interesting thing. It gets stuck in 95% of people diagnosed with dyslexia. It creates a midline dividing line through the body, all the way from the top of the head, right the way through the body to here. So, for example, I'll get my glasses. If you can imagine, if I'm testing someone's oculomotor functioning, I'll get a pen and I'll say, okay, you stand still and I'm just going to have a look at how your eyes are tracking, okay? And what I want to see is can their eyes cross that midline point. Now, someone with an ATNR that's retained will typically do this. So if you actually see, my eyes are doing completely and utterly nothing, and I'm moving my entire body so they don't. In fact, the worst I've seen was this cute little boy who literally did this. Because his eyes actually couldn't do anything because of a retained ATNR. And when you then say, can you keep your head completely still and let's just see what happens, you get to that midline point and the eyes jump, okay? So when someone with dyslexia says, well, the words jump on the page, or I keep skipping a line. Of course, the words aren't jumping, their eyes are jumping, and they're jumping because there is something that is dividing the system. And that goes all the way through the brain, through the hemisphere. So if they're reading this half of the page, it's with this half of their brain, and the other half of the page with this half of the brain. You never get full interhemispheric integration. Which is interesting, because there are many studies into the dyslexic brain saying when dyslexics read, both sides of the brain seem to light up on a brain map rather than differentiation. That's because differentiation never got the chance to happen because of this retained reflex. I'm just going to quickly show you... Oh, no, I don't want to show you that. Can we go back again? Yes, this little girl, this is just an example of someone who got rid of an ATNR reflex. This was only over, I think it was like a 6-week period or so, and her mum sent me in this from her vocab book, and she said, look, she can suddenly write. And it wasn't that she'd practiced writing, it was just that she got rid of the ATNR reflex, and she could actually cross the midline when she was writing and see what she was doing. So it can have a dramatic impact. There was another boy I'm thinking of that came to the clinic who was 16, just did some exams and flunked them all hideously. He'd been diagnosed with dyslexia. And he did a very intensive neurodevelopmental program, which was twice a day, coming in, doing 30 minutes exercises with clinicians. Anyway, at the end of that, he got an immediate 20% uplift in all his grades across the board. And his comment to his mother was, I never knew how it felt to be able to concentrate before. Because if you've got all this negative biohacking going on, you don't know how it is to concentrate. So let me give you another example, and this is a really important one when we talk about anxiety. This is the Moro reflex.
We're now going to look at the Moro reflex. The Moro reflex is that we'll have the baby in flexion, comfortable, unsuspecting as soon as it's coming, and then we will drop the baby for a few inches. He goes out into extension, and flexion at the elbow, and then gradually comes back in. And oftentimes the hand is in a C position with the thumb and the index finger. Do that one more time. Just watch the movements of the hands. Okay.
Ghastly, isn't it?
It goes out.
But listen, it's the reason we take our first breath. It's the reason if we're not breathing, a doctor will dangle you upside down by your feet to get you to go like this. And as you do it, adrenaline, cortisol floods the system. It's a kickstart to the system. It's an early, again, evolutionary mechanism that if a baby was left here and you were foraging over there, any change to that baby's environment, you'd be alerted. Marvelous. Should have gone by 3 months of age. But when it gets stuck, it wreaks havoc, okay? It makes you hugely over-emotional, prone to mood swings, body armoring. It messes up your auditory functioning, your balance mechanism, your spatial awareness. Even pupillary constriction to light is reduced, longer-term hyperglycemia, panic attacks, huge dislike of change, needing to control everything around you. I just put this in just because I happen to love Niles. He's a great example of a retained Moro.
Safety. Hygiene.
Oh, jeez.
I would like to introduce you to the first defense in the war against germs, Officer Pocket Square. Okay. Maybe it's not cool to carry a handkerchief around anymore.
It's not.
Is influenza cool? Is scarlet fever cool? Do you have any idea how many germs there are on just one finger? Yes, that finger, for example. It's millions. Or take simple dust. You know what dust is? It's the excretion of mites, little bugs that are eating your skin right now.
So I think you get the idea anyway. I was just being gratuitous, including him. But the Moro reflex can be very, very debilitating. So again, there's a little boy I remember that came to the clinic diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And I remember giving this list of what a retained Moro reflex does to his mother. And she looked at it and said, but hang on, isn't this exactly the same as a description of what Asperger's is? And actually it is, and I ended up doing a paper on that very subject. We got rid of his reflex, and I had to warn her it would get worse before it got better, because you actually stimulate it to get rid of it. So the first 2 weeks, he was more and more tearful, more and more clingy, and then suddenly he completely and utterly changed. Before he'd been having regular panic attacks, he wouldn't eat regular food, he was really fussy about it, he was being bullied at school, nothing was working. And he stopped the panic attacks. He was awarded best eater in the school. He made it to the A-list cricket team, and he could ride a bike, which he couldn't do before. And he actually stood up to this bully. He walked nose to nose to this bully and said, "Go away and don't ever talk to me like that again." And his mum was in tears on the sofa. And he lost his diagnosis. For him, it was a huge retained reflex that was causing the problem. I haven't got time, or I tell you about a woman with agoraphobia, because phobic people also tend to have retained Moros and TLRs. Want to talk to you just to touch on what Dr. George had said about the auditory processing part of it, really critically important. I'm going to give you a quick example of just regular hearing. Could we play the sound clip at the top, please?
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to free speech is my passionate belief that the second most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely.
So that's Rowan Atkinson talking about free speech. I just want to give you an example of what happens when the hearing gets messed up. So first I'm going to talk to you about auditory distortion. So when we give a hearing test, normally people say, well, my kid's fine, they've had their hearing tested, they're not deaf, there's no problem. But that won't tell us how they're actually hearing. To do that, you've got to test the quietest possible thing, threshold hearing, across the whole range of language, about 11 different frequencies. In an ideal world, we want to see both ears hearing at about the same volume level. But very often I'll see something that'll look like the Alpine slopes on an audiogram. And that means they're hearing a bit of language incredibly loudly, and then they're missing the next bit. It sounds something like this.
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of relating to is my belief that the most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely.
Right, so it's a bit like being on a mobile phone in an area of poor reception. It becomes very, very difficult. If you've got a child in class with that kind of hearing, no, they haven't got hearing loss, but those loud sounds are overwhelming the quieter sounds, and they're told, they've got poor concentration. Now, even more complicated is where you have poor lateralization. So you might have a child that goes to this ear to hear one particular frequency of sound, and then jumps to the other side to listen to another frequency. And different bits of language happen at different frequencies. Consonants are kind of low, vowels in the middle, sibilants in the high sound. So that's important, because sounds entering your right ear go straight here to where we process a lot of speech and language. But if you hear in your left ear, it's got to go to the right hemisphere, cross the corpus callosum, and that can be a variable time frame. There's a lot of individual difference in that time frame. But what it can mean is that bits of language hit that area of the brain in the wrong order. So if I say cat, if the A went to my right ear, it might be act that I'm actually receiving. So here's an example of poor lateralization.
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to free speech is my passionate belief that the second most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely.
Okay, so can you imagine trying to unscramble that mess, make sense of it, and then think about answering the question that you were asked by your boss or by your teacher. Last bit, which already was alluded to, hypersensitive and or painful hearing. I think we won't bother playing that then. Or should we? Okay, do a quick clip of what that is.
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to speech is my passionate belief that the second
so we
most
can cut that
precious
off.
thing
No.
in life.
Imagine that multiplied 100 times, and that's how it can feel to be autistic, okay? So when people assume that someone doesn't want to be social, Maybe it's just so completely and utterly overwhelming that they are choosing to withdraw. And very often, if you sort that part out, everything else becomes a lot easier and a lot more tolerable, as we saw earlier. So the hearing. So we basically give the ears a workout with a 10-day intensive listening program, that forces the 3 muscles, the 2 reflexes in the ears, to work much more accurately. And we filter out those particular peaks of hypersensitivity so that the brain is rewiring to be able to focus on the other sounds better and paying less attention to those higher frequencies. I'm cutting through this very quickly, but suffice it to say, we often have huge improvements as a result of it, not just academic performance, but in terms of anxiety, in terms of reading comprehension, processing speeds, interestingly, memory functioning as well, and overall self-esteem. So, cutting to the end, resist the temptation to just target the tip of the iceberg. Just because a problem's manifesting itself there doesn't mean that that's where it's originating from. Focus on trying to undo any negative biohacking, if possible, before we start looking at enhancing the positive. Because freedom from compensation leaves the grey matter of the brain free to be able to learn and to grow if we can take that burden off someone's system. And people without that burden are the people who are more resilient. They're the people who can suffer nature's outrageous slings and arrows. Sorry, I've got that completely wrong. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and be able to do it with a smile on their faces as opposed to caving. Thank you very much.